Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a bird's beak in pastels. Now the first thing that I like to do is make sense of the main shapes that I see, so I'm just using a black Carbothello pencil here to map in the nostril. Now depending on the bird that you're drawing, the nostril shape is going to vary considerably. For this peacock it's far longer than it is wider, so that is something that we really have to get right. The shape and size of the nostril, just like the eye, is going to really affect the proportions of that animal, so it's so important to get your main shapes correct. Now the next part I decided to work on was the lower section of the beak, and the only reason for that is because it was smaller. It was less overwhelming, so this was a good place to start. So I'm just blocking this in with one solid colour for the time being. Now this isn't something that I would normally recommend to do because there are many light and dark changes in any area that we're working on. But for this, it's such a small section and I wanted to make sure that I captured a little bit more of that smoother texture. So I wanted to work with more of a solid base and then add my layers on top. But I can't stress enough, I don't usually do this. I like to pay very close attention to the lights and the darks. But the beak on the lower portion, it was much smoother. There wasn't a huge amount of detail, so I could get away with this layering process. Now you can see here that I'm using a few different colours. Because this is a shinier surface, it is going to be a little bit more reflective, so you might have some colours from the feathers of the bird, the environment, the surroundings, and so on. So it is something that I do like to pay very close attention to. Now one of the other techniques that I'm focusing on here is softening. As I'm using my lighter pencils, I'm also using that to blend into the layers underneath. I'm not using any tools as yet to blend those pastels, I'm just achieving all of that with the pencils. Now in order to do this, you want to use light pressure. The more pressure you apply, the harsher your line is going to be. So that therefore means you're going to end up hinting at more detail rather than softening and blending. Now with anything that we're drawing, the lighting is so important. In every single one of my YouTube videos, I talk about the importance of contrast. Now I feel this is one of the things that's going to help build up that more realistic portrait, more of that three-dimensional feel. This therefore is something that I cover thoroughly in all of my real-time step-by-step tutorials on Patreon. Now the example of that here is, although I'm using my lighter pencils, I'm staying away from the very top edge. That there is that darker first layer that I started with. That's helping to make it look like already the top portion of the beak is casting a slight shadow on the lower portion. This helps with that three-dimensional feel and more of a realistic portrait. Now when it comes to working on the top part of the beak, you can see that I'm curving my pencils around the nostril. This is where I like to start to help again to build up that shape and form. I don't want to just move my pencils randomly, I want to try to make sure that I'm studying that reference photo as closely as I can. Now although there's no fur texture to draw here, you will be able to see tiny little scratches and marks on the beak. It won't necessarily be completely smooth like glass. You do want to make sure that you're capturing any tiny little detail, but don't add those too soon. But I do still like to make sure that I'm moving my pencil following the direction of those, because that helps us to study that reference photo more accurately as we continue to layer. Now that I've got some of that base foundation in, this is also where I'm starting to incorporate more of my bluer colours in the beak itself. This is also that reflected and bounced light, so some of this might be the sky, it could also be the beautiful blue feathers on the top of the face. All of that I want to try to make sure that I can capture. Now this isn't a massive portrait, this is only an 8 by 8 inch, so the size of the beak is fairly small. But by making sure that I'm paying attention to my lights and my darks rather than all of the detail, this is going to look very realistic. This is why the values and contrast is one of my main priorities. It doesn't really matter what colour blue I use as long as I use a lighter blue for a highlight and the darker blue for a shadow. Now even though I start off with more of a greyer base, I am still incorporating my blues, but because I'm mixing the layers together, I'm building up that depth gradually. You can see here when I work with my white pencil, I'm saving that for more of my later layers. I don't want to jump into using my brightest pencils first, because that's going to significantly limit the depth that we create. Now this would be exactly the same when drawing fur. I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I focus on many different fur textures, different bird drawings for various feathers, so I'll put a couple of those in the description below if they're of interest. And it is all about focusing on how that layering process should be achieved. That's going to of course vary depending on the fur texture, whether or not we draw a more complex feather structure such as an owl. That would be different to the feathers of the peacock. Now I do have a time-lapse video of this peacock available here on YouTube, so I will link that in the description below as well if that's of interest. And again here, I'm focusing on the blending. I don't want any harsh start and stop points at this base layer stage. I've worked with a good base foundation and I've darkened up where that shadow is to hint where it curves over the side of the beak. Potentially there the light source is not able to reach that part, so it is going to be naturally darker. This is already, although it contains no detail, it already starts to take on more of that rounded three-dimensional shape because of the values. So this is something that I really did want this little video to focus on, because it is a prime example of how getting the values in first can help to build up that shape. It's not about worrying about the exact colour. Now I do have a specific video, I've got a couple of them on my Patreon channel, where I do focus on how to pick the pencils based on the colours we see in our reference photo. I've got a giraffe drawing and a tiger eye study, both of which I show a very simple colour wheel system. It's not overwhelming or complex, but it can really benefit us to know which pencil we should be using from the many that we could have in front of us. Now one thing here is you've seen I've worked in pretty much 3 sections. I started with the lower part of the beak, I then worked on the top around the nostril, and now I'm working on the midsection. This here is helping for me to break this up into very manageable chunks. I personally don't like to work in one whole layer and then work on my next layer and so on. I find that I end up rushing that layering process and skipping those valuable layers that really do make a difference. So in order for me to avoid that from happening, because it's personally something that I know I do, I like to break it up into smaller chunks. Now if you are an artist who likes to work with one layer at a time, so you want to do your base layer for the entire subject, then your second layer and so on, if that works for you, then of course that's absolutely fine. But if you do feel like you're starting to rush slightly, it might be worth working on a smaller scale. Just really work on that one area that you're focusing on, get that to about 80-90% complete, and then work on the area next to it. You can then slowly piece the puzzle together, and then before you know it, you've got more of that drawing done a little bit quicker. I just find I'm a little bit more efficient with how I work if I break it up in manageable parts. However, I can't stress enough that if you do like to work in whole individual layers, then absolutely stick with that. There's no reason to change if you do prefer working that way. So it's at this stage now where I've got a good base foundation. I've really hinted at those subtle midtones to create that impression of that smoother texture, and now I can come in and reinforce some of the bluer colours and those finer highlights. The lighter details, we don't want to get too carried away adding those, because we could potentially add too many. Because the highlights make a big difference, we can therefore get a bit carried away. So it is something you want to pay very close attention to. Adding highlights or shadows where they're not needed will change the structure of that area. So potentially, let's say on the face, if you were to start adding more highlights around the eye, you could change the shape and position of the eye socket. That there potentially would change the whole expression of that animal. So that's something that we must pay very close attention to. Now I have just left this tiny snippet in here where I'm adding final details around on the rest of the face. The reason being, it's usually when we've got something else drawn in and completed that we realise we need to come back and make changes elsewhere. These changes can make a big difference. It might only be 1 or 2 minutes spent at the end of that drawing, but it really can take your artwork to the next level. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be very, very grateful. And I do upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to this real-time tutorial of the peacock on my Patreon channel, then I'll link all of that in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.